The Paper King. The first thing Elias Turner ever sold was not a newspaper. It was a button. He was 13 years old, standing just outside a streetcar stop in the fall of 1938 with a tray hanging from his neck by a fraying strap his mother had sewn twice already. The button was cheap tin, painted with a fading flag and a slogan from some local campaign nobody believed in anymore. A businessman in a brown hat bought it not because he wanted it, but because Elias looked him in the eye when he asked for a nickel and said, "Sir, it still fastens well." That was Elias. Even as a boy, he did not beg, he offered. He came from a narrow clapboard house at the edge of a mill town where the windows rattled when freight trains went by and the floors held the memory of every hard winter the family had survived. His father, Samuel Turner, worked 12-hour shifts at a paper mill that smelled of wet wood pulp, hot grease, and chemicals that clung to a man's skin long after he came home. His mother, Ruth, stayed at home because there was nowhere else for her to be. She mended, scrubbed, stretched soup, and made one chicken last 2 days longer than common sense said it should. The Depression had not ended in that house just because newspapers said recovery was underway. Men still came home tired and underpaid. Shoes still got resold instead of replaced. Meat still depended on the week. Samuel was proud, but Elias had seen him once, late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with a pencil and a stack of unpaid bills, rubbing his forehead like he could erase numbers by force of will. His mother had stood in the doorway, hands tucked in her apron, saying nothing, because sometimes silence was the only kindness left. Elias never forgot that sight, so after school he went out. He sold newspapers on corners and outside the rail station. He sold pencils, combs, polished marbles, shoelaces, handkerchiefs, peppermint sticks in winter, and paper pinwheels in spring. He sold little legal things boys could get from wholesalers, church fairs, older cousins, or junk drawers. Trinkets, doodads, whatever could turn a few cents into a few more. He learned early what people bought out of need and what they bought out of mood. A tired man bought tobacco papers. A hurried woman bought hairpins. A soldier on leave bought a cheap ring and a postcard. Children bought noise and color. Office clerks bought convenience. Nobody bought pity for long. He was a good boy, though town roughness found its way into him the way soot found its way into laundry. He could take a shove and shove back. He knew when to run from older boys and when running would invite worse. He had a scar over one eyebrow from a bottle tossed in an alley dispute over a selling spot near the station. He learned to keep his jaw set and his money in different pockets. He was polite to ladies, deferential to men who deserved it, and wary of men who demanded it without earning it. He also learned the geography of want. Every corner had its own economy. The block outside the rail station moved newspapers fastest on weekdays before 7 in the morning, but on Saturdays the business belonged to small toys and candy because women came down with children in tow and patience ran thin. The block near the machine shop was good for tobacco and laces because men coming off shift wanted small comforts and their boots took a beating. The block near the post office was different still. People there bought things for others, stamps and cards and peppermint wrapped in paper for parceling out at Christmas. Elias kept a mental ledger. He did not call it that. He just called it knowing. At home, he handed over most of what he made. His mother would protest every time. "Keep some for yourself." "I do," he would lie. Samuel noticed, though he said little at first. One night, after a week of rain had killed foot traffic, and Elias came home with damp socks and only 37 cents in his pocket, his father set down his fork and said, "You are not the man of this house." "No, sir," Elias said. "I am." "Yes, sir." Samuel looked at him for a long time. The silence between them had weight, not the cruel kind, but the kind men carry when love embarrasses them in both directions at once. But you are my son. So if you are going to work, then work like an honest man. Count right, speak right, don't cheat, don't let anybody cheat you, and don't ever get so hungry you sell your name along with the merchandise. Elias remembered that too. He remembered it years later in boardrooms when men tried to buy his compliance wrapped in flattery. He remembered it the first time someone offered him a side arrangement and called it standard practice. He remembered it every time the temptation to shorten a corner arrived dressed as efficiency or pragmatism. It held. His father's voice, plain and tired and certain, held. Across the state, in a city where broad trees shaded the avenue and brick homes stood back from the road as if money required more space around it, another boy was growing up under a very different roof. Charles Pembroke III was born into polished wood, silver tea sets, and the certainty that his future had been decided before he learned to spell his own name. His father ran Pembroke and Vale, a finance house built on old loans, rail interests, insurance holdings, and generations of men who believed the world was most stable when it was owned by the right families. His mother hosted dinners. His sisters were beautiful, well-educated, and expected to marry well. Charles, the only son, was expected to inherit. He attended private school in pressed uniforms, spent summers at a lake house with rowboats and tutors, and learned early how wealth speaks softly because it assumes everyone will lean in to hear it. He was not stupid. That was the dangerous part. He was clever, handsome in the severe way magazines admired, and raised to believe his instincts were evidence of breeding. When people praised him, they often meant his father. When doors opened for him, he mistook the hinges for destiny. Charles was the kind of boy who won races and assumed the track had been level. His tutors found him quick and responsive, a natural at figures and rhetoric, with a particular gift for making others feel they had come to his conclusions on their own. His father, a cold man of precise gestures, watched his son from a careful distance and approved in the way one approves of a found investment, not with warmth exactly, but with satisfaction. There was a dinner at the Pembroke house when Charles was 15, at which his father introduced him to 3 men whose last names appeared in railroad histories. "This is Charles," his father had said, nothing more, but the boy had understood the sentence was really, "This is the next one." He had spent his whole life living up to the introduction he had not yet earned. If Elias grew up measuring the price of each thing, Charles grew up measuring the rank of each person. Elias learned value. Charles learned hierarchy. By 1944, war had transformed the country. Factories boomed, rationing reshaped habits, and paper, plain, practical paper, became more valuable than most people realized. Packing paper, ledger paper, shipping labels, government forms, military documentation, wrappers, cartons, stock sheets. Paper was how goods moved, how records lived, how orders became action. The Turner Mill, where Samuel worked, expanded. It took on government contracts. Men who had once worried about layoffs now worried about overtime. Elias finished high school with good marks and no money for college. His teachers told him he had a head for numbers. A principal even wrote a letter to a state college, but the answer might as well have been written in another language. Tuition, books, room, board, impossible things. Samuel offered to borrow. Ruth offered to sell her wedding brooch. Elias refused both. He refused not out of pride alone, though there was some. He refused because he had done the arithmetic already, sitting at the same kitchen table where his father's bills had been spread like accusations. The interest on borrowed money, the lost wages during enrollment, the time until any degree might pay back, it did not compute. Not for them. Not now. Maybe not ever. He folded the rejection and put it in the drawer where things went that could not be helped. The mill had a mailroom. That was where he started. He was 18, thin but broadening through the shoulders, with neat handwriting and the kind of alertness supervisors noticed because it made other men look sleepy beside him. He sorted internal memos, invoices, shipping confirmations, supplier bills, payroll envelopes, vendor contracts, and correspondence from customers across state lines. Most people saw paper. Elias saw movement, money in, money out, delay here, waste there, repetition in ordering, inconsistency in freight rates. He started recognizing patterns the way he had once recognized what sold at which corner and at what hour. A month into the job, the assistant comptroller came down looking for a misfiled invoice. Elias found not only that invoice, but 2 duplicates and a freight overcharge that had been paid twice. "Who caught this?" the man asked. Elias hesitated. "I did, sir." "You?" "Yes, sir." The assistant controller took the papers, frowned, then asked, "Did you study bookkeeping?" "No, sir." "You intend to?" "If I can afford it." He could not. But the question lingered. Within the year, Elias was moved to a junior bookkeeping desk in a cramped office near payroll. It was unofficial at first. He still made less than men with certificates and degrees, and everyone knew why. But he worked nights, borrowing old accounting texts, teaching himself balance sheets, cost allocation, inventory controls, and the arithmetic of industrial survival. He wrote everything twice to make sure it held. He asked questions of anyone who had the patience to answer. Older accountants, a retired auditor who lived 2 streets from his parents and liked that Elias sat still and listened. A woman in the billing department named Marjorie, who had done the same work as the men around her for half the salary and twice the accuracy. He took their knowledge seriously because he had nothing else to trade for it. Supervisors who first treated him like a novelty began handing him more work than they admitted. He married young, at 24, to a woman named Annabelle. She was the daughter of a school custodian, with dark hair pinned simply and a smile that had nothing flashy in it, which was exactly why Elias trusted it. She was calm where he was driven, warm where he was guarded, and practical enough to understand that love was not a feeling you announced, but a thing you kept proving. She could host a dinner with 6 people and make it seem abundant even when the roast was small. She loved his parents as if they were already partly hers. They had 2 children, a boy named Samuel after Elias's father, and a girl they named Margaret after Ruth's own mother, a woman who had come from somewhere farther south under circumstances Ruth did not speak of directly but carried visibly in the set of her jaw. Anna raised them with the same steady grace she applied to everything. She made sure they had piano lessons and library cards and the knowledge that the world would demand more from them than it demanded from some others, and that this was not an injustice to be mourned so much as a condition to be prepared for. When Elias got his first serious promotion, he did not buy himself a new suit. He paid off Samuel and Ruth's debts. When he got the next one, he moved them into a better house. Samuel cried only once in his adult life, and it was when Elias handed him the deed and said, "You can sit at a table now without bills climbing up your elbows." He stood in the kitchen of the new house for a long moment, holding the deed without looking at it, his hand trembling very slightly. Ruth put her hand on his arm. She didn't say anything. Neither did Elias. Some things completed themselves in silence. Across the years, Charles Pembroke's path looked smoother from a distance, but it had its own pressures. He went to the best schools, then to an Ivy League college where professors called him Pembroke and assumed he would run something vast. He learned banking, law, international finance, and the art of speaking in rooms full of men who hid knives inside compliments. He married Evelyn Ashcroft, whose family had old money of its own, and theirs became the sort of union newspapers mentioned in the society pages, with too much detail about flowers and too little about feeling. Evelyn was beautiful, yes, but more than that, she was composed. She understood rooms, timing, and the performance of elegance. She loved Charles in the way one loves a man who is both inheritance and burden. They had children, a son and later 2 daughters, and from the beginning, Charles looked at the boy as if seeing the next relay runner in a race he himself had never truly chosen. What Evelyn understood and kept to herself, because Pembroke women were not taught to share such things, was that Charles was profoundly frightened, not of failure in the ordinary sense, of irrelevance, of the possibility that he was ordinary dressed in extraordinary cloth, that without the name and the wealth and the rooms full of men who called him sir from instilled habit, he would be revealed as simply a man of middling gifts who had confused inheritance with aptitude. The acquisitions, the expansions, the relentless growth of the Pembroke portfolio, these were not the projects of a satisfied man. They were the projects of a man trying to outrun a verdict only he could hear. By the early 1950s, Elias had become a rising manager at Turner Paper and Stock. By the late 1950s, Charles was a vice president at Pembroke and Vale. Their industries should have kept them apart. One was finance, abstract and strategic, where fortunes shifted over signatures and dead structures. The other was manufacturing and distribution, loud and physical, where fortunes depended on timber contracts, rail schedules, labor agreements, processing efficiency, and how many tons could be delivered without spoilage or delay. But the country was changing. Markets were consolidating. Capital wanted scale. Finance did not merely lend anymore, it hunted ownership. Turner Paper had become a beast. The company no longer served only regional accounts. It sold paper stock, specialty paper products, packaging materials, and industrial supply lines across the United States, then into Canada, then overseas. It did not glamorize itself. It simply worked. It printed money, as one analyst put it in a Pembroke internal memo years later. High demand, low flash, relentless cash flow, few serious competitors with comparable infrastructure. Pembroke and Vale noticed. At first, it was just interest, banking relationships, lending proposals, invitations to dinners, friendly inquiries about expansion capital. Turner's board, still mostly practical men with dirt under the nails origins, despite increasing sophistication, kept them at arm's length. The company had grown through stubbornness, retained earnings, and discipline. It did not trust silk too quickly. Elias, by then a senior vice president, distrusted it least of all. He met Charles Pembroke for the first time at an industry banquet in Chicago. It was 1961. The ballroom was full of cigar smoke, cut crystal, and that post-war confidence men wore when they believed the country itself had endorsed their ambition. Elias had come in a dark suit that fit him well, but not extravagantly. Charles wore tailored perfection. They were both around 36, both already formidable, both used to being the one other men watched when decisions were made. Charles approached with a glass in one hand and a smile in place. "Mr. Turner," he said, "I've wanted to meet the man making all that paper." Elias shook his hand. "And I've heard of the man trying to buy everything it's written on." Charles laughed. "That's a line worth stealing." "Then I shouldn't have said it to a finance man." Charles's smile tightened just enough to register. "You people always act insulted when capital takes an interest. You people always act surprised when interest isn't returned." There it was. Not open hostility yet, but recognition. The clash did not come from misunderstanding. It came from understanding too well. They spent the next 20 minutes in reluctant conversation, circling each other the way two capable men do when they recognize a threat wearing the same dinner clothes as an opportunity. Charles asked pointed questions about Turner's international operations, framed as curiosity, which they were not. Elias answered precisely enough to be polite and vaguely enough to be useless. At the end, Charles extended a hand again and said, "I expect we'll be seeing more of each other." "I expect so," Elias said. "Let's make it productive." "Let's make it honest," Elias replied. "That might be harder for one of us." He was not sure which one of them he meant. Neither was Charles, which was the point. Over the next decade, the rivalry sharpened. Pembroke and Vail made quiet attempts to gain leverage over Turner through debt instruments, proxy relationships, supplier financing, and secondary holdings accumulated through shell entities. Elias sniffed them out more than once. He had a street boy's instincts inside a boardroom man's body. He knew when someone was walking toward him, smiling, with purchase in mind. He learned corporate law the way he had once learned newspapers and trinkets, because not knowing meant somebody else ate first. There was a supplier in Ohio who had done business with Turner for 11 years, a timber concern, solid and reliable, who suddenly came to Elias with news that a new financing arrangement had been proposed by a New York intermediary. The terms were favorable, almost too favorable, and the company offering them was a subsidiary 3 layers removed from Pembroke and Vail. Elias saw the shape of it before the supplier finished his sentence. He restructured Turner's relationship with that supplier into a partial equity arrangement, which made the supplier a stakeholder rather than a target. And when the intermediary came back with sweetened terms, he found the door already closed. The supplier sent Elias a bottle of good whiskey at Christmas for the next 20 years. Charles, for his part, came to dislike Elias personally. Not because Elias was rude, he rarely was, but because he could not be managed by class performance. He did not defer to lineage. He did not seem impressed by old names, private clubs, or elegant threats. In meetings, Charles would present acquisitions as inevitabilities dressed as opportunities. Elias would listen, ask 2 questions, and expose the underlying appetite. You call it integration, Elias once told him in New York, seated across a long conference table while lawyers stared at their notepads. But what you want is control without learning the business. Charles folded his hands. What we want is efficiency. No, Elias said. What you want is to inherit cash flow you didn't build. One of Charles's attorneys cleared his throat. Charles leaned forward. And what exactly did you inherit, Mr. Turner? The room got quiet. Elias looked at him steadily. Strong legs, a good mother, and the good sense not to confuse a head start with superior breeding. That story traveled. Charles heard the various versions of it over the following months, and each one bothered him more than the last. Not because they were unfair, he knew they were essentially accurate, but because they made him sound like a man who had lost on character rather than on tactics. Which was worse? A man could recover from a tactical defeat. What Charles found harder to shake was the nagging possibility that Elias Turner saw something about him that he himself preferred not to examine too closely. So did the others. The attempted share accumulations, the proxy fights, the debt pressure campaigns, the failed persuasion efforts. Each time Pembroke and Vail advanced, Turner paper fortified. Elias persuaded the board to expand employee stock programs for senior leadership, restructure voting protections, diversify lenders, renegotiate supplier terms, and build international relationships that made hostile acquisition more complicated. He was not the owner, but he became the backbone. Even those on the board who once viewed him as the millman who rose too high began relying on him more than they liked to admit. Then age did what ambition could not delay. Turner's longtime chief executive retired due to illness, and against the preferences of some older directors who still dreamed of pedigree, Elias Turner was named CEO. Not long after, Charles Pembroke III became chief executive of Pembroke and Vail, succeeding his father in a transfer so ceremonial it might as well have happened at birth. The newspapers treated them differently. Charles was written about as a successor. Elias was written about as a phenomenon. That rankled Charles more than he let on. He mentioned it once to Evelyn over breakfast. The newspaper folded to the article about Elias, and she had looked at him in that composed way she had and said, "Then give them less reason to be surprised." He had put the paper down and said nothing. She was right, which made it worse. By then, both men had children nearing adulthood. Both had wives who understood what power cost at home. Annabelle remained Elias's steady harbor, even as their house grew larger and their social obligations heavier. She reminded him to visit his mother. She remembered the names of machinists' wives and warehouse clerks' sons. She was beloved in a way that could not be bought, because she treated janitors and senators with the same direct grace. Evelyn Pembroke remained impeccable, admired, and slightly untouchable. She hosted charity galas flawlessly and protected the family image like a second occupation. She knew Charles could be vain and cutting. She also knew he believed acquisition was proof of virility. Pembroke and Vail had swallowed banks, regional firms, insurance, and commercial holdings. But Turner Paper lingered beyond his reach, like an insult preserved in brick and pulp. Years passed, and the company only grew. Turner Paper became Turner International Paper and Supply, then simply Turner Global in common business speech, because it no longer sold only paper. It sold packaging systems, industrial stock, specialty materials, export products, and supply chain solutions across continents. The old mill had become a juggernaut, and still Charles wanted it. By the mid-1970s, he saw an opening. Regulations had shifted, markets were softer. Some Turner board members had grown complacent. A few outside investors were restless for unlocking value. Pembroke and Vail began a new campaign, more sophisticated than the earlier ones. Not crude takeover language, strategic partnership, capital optimization, shareholder enhancement, a merger of strengths. It was the same wolf in a better coat. This time, some at Turner listened. Elias did too. He did not reject the approach outright. That surprised Charles. At their first private meeting on the matter, Charles sat in his office above Lower Manhattan, all polished glass and inherited certainty. He poured 2 drinks. Elias left his untouched. Charles smiled. "You've changed." "No," Elias said. "I've learned that sometimes the best way to stop a man is to let him walk closer." Charles gave a low chuckle. Still dramatic. "And you still think you're the smartest man in the room because your father paid the electric bill before you were born." Charles's jaw shifted. "At least I know what legacy looks like." "Do you?" Elias asked. "Or do you just know what possession feels like?" The proposal was rich. Too rich, some said. Pembroke and Vail would acquire controlling interest in Turner through a structured combination, allowing current leadership to remain temporarily in place. Elias would stay on in an executive role, perhaps even as president under a broader holding structure. To many, it looked flattering. To Elias, it looked like a silk coffin. He dug. He always dug. Turner had internal analysts now, legal teams, Manda specialists, people who could run circles around the mailroom boy he had once been. But Elias still knew where to look. He asked old-fashioned questions. Who gains first? Who controls debt post-merger? Which assets are being leveraged? What do the footnotes conceal? What happens to the mills, the workers, the pension obligations, the distribution backbone? He also knew the human questions. Which Pembroke directors had doubts they were not voicing? Which investment bankers advising the deal were collecting fees on both ends of it? Which Turner shareholders had been courted quietly over the past 18 months in ways that had never been disclosed? He made calls. He traveled. He had lunch with men who liked to talk when properly appreciated, and dinner with women who ran the administrative apparatus of Pembroke and Vail and knew where everything was filed. He was thorough, and he was patient, and he was willing to bore himself for weeks if boredom led somewhere. And beneath the elegant paperwork, he found it. Pembroke and Vail was overextended, not collapsing, not publicly, but burdened. Charles had been chasing prestige acquisitions with increasing aggression, financing confidence with debt, and expecting scale to cure appetite. Turner was not merely desired. Turner was needed. Its cash flow, asset base, and operating resilience would stabilize Pembroke's growing fragility and give Charles what he wanted most, not just wealth, but vindication. It was no longer a hunt. It was desperation dressed as conquest. Elias took that knowledge to the Turner board. The room split almost immediately. Some directors saw danger and rallied behind him. Others saw opportunity and wanted to cash out before markets turned. One director, older and smooth, suggested that perhaps Elias's judgment was emotionally entangled by his long tenure. Elias looked at him and said, "My tenure is the only reason you still have a company worth selling." That ended the niceties. The proxy battle that followed became vicious. Financial press speculated weekly. Rumors leaked. Consultants multiplied. Pembroke allied voices described Turner as sentimental, outdated, resistant to modernization. Anonymous items hinted that Elias was a brilliant operator, but unsuited for the complexities of global capital. There were whispers that he came from the shop floor and still thought like it. He did. That was why he understood what numbers meant when human hands were attached to them. Pembroke's people were not wrong that the strategy was sophisticated. They deployed it with precision. A sympathetic financial columnist ran a series of articles about stagnant governance at Turner, which was close enough to certain truths to seem credible. A consulting firm released a report recommending structural modernization in Turner's management, a report commissioned, though not visibly, by an entity with Pembroke ties. 3 Turner shareholders received unexpected invitations to exclusive investment conferences in New York and London, where they found themselves at dinners with Pembroke's most charming principals. It was not bribery. It was hospitality with an agenda, which was cleaner only in the legal sense. Elias responded in kind where he could. He retained 2 of the sharpest M&A attorneys in the country, neither of whom liked Pembroke and Vail for professional reasons that long predated this fight. He reached out to pension fund managers who held Turner shares and whose primary concern was long-term stability rather than acquisition premiums, and he told them plainly what would happen to that stability if Charles's debt-laden structure took root. He went to the press, not anonymously, not with spin, but with facts, laid out in the tone of a man who had nothing to hide and everything to lose. Turner employees heard the rumors. So did unions, suppliers, foreign buyers, and regional politicians. Fear spread. Would plants close? Would pensions shrink? Would decision-making move to New York? Would paper men become line items in a finance portfolio? Elias went back to the mills, not for show, because he needed to be reminded what he was fighting for. He walked the old plant where his father had worked. Samuel was long retired by then, slower in step, but still proud. Ruth had passed some years before. Elias stood near the loading floor and watched younger men move stock with the same bent shoulders his father once had. The smell of pulp and steam hit him like memory made physical. A foreman said, "You think they'll sell us?" Elias answered honestly, "Not if I can stop it." "Can you?" Elias looked across the floor. "I've been stopping them my whole life." The foreman, a compact man named Delbert with 23 years at the plant, nodded once. He didn't offer encouragement or doubt. He just said, "Then I'll keep the line clean," as if tidiness were a form of faith, as if doing the job well was the only contribution a floorman could make to the larger battle. Elias thought about that for a long time afterward. He thought it was probably the most useful thing anyone said to him in that whole war. The climax came in a board vote preceded by one final negotiation between Elias and Charles. They met not in New York and not at a banquet, but at Turner's original headquarters in a conference room overlooking warehouses and rail lines. Elias chose the ground deliberately. Outside the windows, business moved in real time. Freight, labor, shipments, product, not abstractions, output. Charles arrived with counsel and certainty. Elias with binders and quiet. The meeting stretched for hours. Terms, Counterterms, governance, valuation, control rights, debt assumptions, integration structures, public communications. Every sentence had 10 knives inside it. Charles was sharp, organized, and at his best in this arena. He had been trained for rooms like this since boyhood, and it showed. He knew how to make an argument sound generous while rooting every path back to the outcome he wanted. His counsel was equally polished. At one point, a younger Pembroke attorney laid out a restructuring scenario with such confident precision that two of Elias's own people glanced at each other in a way that had doubt in it. Elias noticed. He said nothing then, but he filed it. At last, Charles dismissed everyone but Elias. The room went still. Charles stood by the window, hands in his pockets, looking at the rail lines below with something that might have been genuine reflection or might have been theater. With Charles, the two were not always distinguishable. "You know," he said, "this could have been graceful." Graceful for whom? For history, for markets, for your shareholders. Elias almost smiled. "You mean for you." Charles turned. "You still don't understand how the world works. Men like you are useful, exceptional, occasionally, admirable even, but institutions endure because families build them, not because one determined boy sells pencils on a corner and climbs high enough to mistake himself for ownership." Elias sat back and looked at him for a long moment. He had heard variations of this sentence his entire career, in polite form, in impolite form, in the form of a declined promotion or a reassigned account or a conference room booking made unavailable at the last minute. He had heard it in the way certain men shook his hand at industry dinners, firm enough to pass inspection and brief enough to signal limit. He had heard it in every footnote of every deal that took twice as long for him as for men who arrived with the right surnames already in place. He was, at this point, genuinely tired of it. Then he said, "That's the problem, Charles. You still think building and owning are the same thing." Charles said nothing. "You inherited authority," Elias continued. "I had to earn trust from men who would fire me the second I stumbled. I know every weak seam in a company because I came in through the basement. I know where waste hides, where vanity sits on the books, where debt starts pretending it's strategy. You thought you were coming here to acquire a paper company. What you were really trying to do was plug a hole in your own." That landed. Charles' face hardened. "Be careful." "No," Elias said. "You be careful." He slid a folder across the table. Inside was enough. Not criminal scandal, something better, leverage, documentation of Pembroke and Vale's exposure, overextension, contingent liabilities, and the internal assumptions underpinning their Turner bid. Some of it came from market intelligence, some from public filings studied properly, some from sources who had lost faith in Charles's appetite. None of it illegal, all of it devastating. Charles picked up the top page and read for perhaps 90 seconds without expression. Then he set it down with a care that was itself a kind of concession. "If this board votes today," Elias said, "I will make clear to the market why you need this deal more than we do." Charles stared at the papers. "You'd tank your own premium." "I'd preserve my company." "You'd start a war." Elias rose from his chair. "Charles, we've been at war since the first time you smiled at me with a contract in your pocket." There was a long silence. Outside, a freight train rolled slowly past on the near track, its load heavy enough to feel in the floor. Charles finally looked up from the folder. His expression had changed. Not broken, not quite, but something had moved behind it. Some pretense had grown too heavy. "You really believe," he said slowly, "that a man can build something that matters more than what he inherits?" "I believe it because I watched it happen," Elias said. "In a mailroom, on a loading dock, in a kitchen in a hard town. I believe it because it's true, and because I suspect some part of you has always known it was true, which is why you've spent so much of your life trying to disprove it by buying everything in sight." Charles had no answer to that. For perhaps the first time in a boardroom, he had no answer at all. The vote went against the deal, not narrowly, decisively. Then, before Pembroke and Vale could recover the narrative, Elias did something no one expected. He launched a targeted counteroffensive, not to acquire Pembroke outright, but to isolate it. Turner announced strategic partnerships with rival financial institutions, refinanced key obligations on superior terms, expanded an employee investor stability trust, and entered a set of international supply agreements that increased its independence while signaling to the market that Turner was not prey. Behind the scenes, several Pembroke directors, shaken by exposure to Charles's overreach, began pressuring him. Investors who once admired aggression now saw recklessness. The old money certainty that had protected him for years became a cage. He had not just failed to acquire Turner, he had shown why he should not be trusted to. Within 2 years, Charles remained wealthy, still powerful, still photographed at the right dinners, but diminished, less feared, more supervised. His son, once groomed in the same long corridor of assumption, now faced a future far less guaranteed than Charles's had been. The boy was not as clever as his father, which had never mattered before. Now it did. The inheritance was smaller, figuratively if not literally, and the name carried less of the weight that names had once automatically carried in rooms full of men who measured status by origin. Elias, meanwhile, won in the only way that ever mattered to him. He kept the company independent. He did more than that, in fact. He prepared it for a future beyond his own personality. He broadened leadership, strengthened succession, and tied executive rewards more closely to long-term stewardship instead of short-term optics. He recruited deliberately from unlikely places, young people who reminded him of himself, not in background necessarily, but in attentiveness, in that particular hunger that comes from having had to pay for everything you know. He made enemies doing it, as all real reformers do, but he was old enough by then not to confuse disapproval with danger. He also thought often about the men and women who had made it possible. Marjorie from Billing, who had trusted him with her knowledge without being asked to. The supplier in Ohio who had taken his equity deal on faith. Delbert the foreman who kept the line clean. The assistant comptroller who had asked a question that changed a life. Samuel, who had handed down a single moral instruction, simple enough to fit on a button and strong enough to carry a career. He thought about them in the way a man thinks about the materials that went into a structure he still lives inside, not always or with great ceremony, but with a kind of gratitude that does not require expression because it has already shaped everything. One evening, long after the battle had quieted, Elias sat on the porch of the house he and Annabelle had lived in for years. It was larger than anything his parents could have imagined, but not ostentatious. The yard was trimmed, the windows glowed warm. Somewhere inside, grandchildren were laughing. Anna sat beside him with a blanket over her knees and a cup cooling in her hands. "You've been quiet," she said. He nodded. "You thinking about him?" "Some." "And?" Elias looked out across the yard. "I used to think beating him would feel bigger." Anna smiled softly. "Does it feel smaller?" "It feels—" He took a breath. "It feels like I spent my whole life outrunning a story someone else wrote for men like me, and now I'm too old to care whether they ever believed it." She reached for his hand. "You know what I think?" she said. "What?" "I think your father would say you never sold your name." That nearly undid him. He sat with it the way you sit with something too large to move, not fighting it, just holding still while it settles. Samuel had died before the final victory, but not before seeing his son become a man of consequence, not before seeing the world come, however reluctantly, to respect what the mill town had made. Ruth had not lived to see the boardrooms, the papers, the headlines, but Elias still heard her voice whenever he was tempted toward vanity. "Keep some for yourself," she had said, and all these years later he understood she had not meant money. She had meant something harder to name and easier to lose. A piece of yourself that does not go to the job, or the fight, or the company, or the long, patient war of becoming someone the world cannot ignore. Something that stays behind the door when you close it in the evening. Something that looks like a grandfather sitting on a porch with a blanket and the sound of laughter coming through the glass. He had managed to keep it. Not perfectly, not without cost, but he had kept it. The story of Elias Turner became legend in certain circles, simplified by magazine writers who liked turning human beings into symbols. They called him self-made. They called him a titan. They called him the paper king. They liked the climb, the rivalry, the victory over privilege. They left out the smaller truths that mattered more. The wet socks, the frayed selling strap, the first overcharge caught in the mailroom, the old debt erased from a kitchen table, the smell of the mill, the long insult of being underpaid because talent arrived without credentials. They left out Delbert and Marjorie and the Ohio supplier, and Anna's quiet corrections late at night when Elias came home angrier than was useful. They left out the years of middle distance when nothing was dramatic, only grinding, only incremental, only the patient accumulation of knowledge and relationship and trust that made the later moments possible. Legends require peaks. The story of any real life is mostly the slope. As for Charles Pembroke, he remained what he had always been, a man born at the top of one staircase who could never understand why another man climbing from the cellar refused to be grateful for the invitation. And in the end, that was why he lost. Because he mistook Elias's decency for softness. He mistook patience for hesitation. He mistook work for something lesser than inheritance. He could not imagine that a poor boy who sold newspapers and trinkets in the years after the Great Depression might grow into a man who understood value more deeply than someone who had owned things all his life. But Elias did. He understood the value of paper when it was still pulp, the value of wages when they were still hope, the value of respect when it had not yet been granted, the value of a company when it was more than numbers on an acquisition sheet, the value of a name when a father tells a son not to sell it. And when the last real attempt came to strip him of what he had helped build, Elias Turner fought not like an aristocrat defending possession, but like a street boy defending his corner, a son defending his parents' sacrifices, a worker defending every hand that had lifted the company into greatness. That was why he won, not because fate favored him, not because he had more money, not because the world was fair. He won because all his life, while other men were being handed their future, he was learning how to survive long enough to deserve one. By the time the papers wrote that he had finally defeated Pembroke and Vale for good, the truth was simpler than the headlines. He had defeated something older than Charles. He had defeated the lie that worth must arrive dressed in privilege to be recognized as power. And somewhere, in the memory of a narrow kitchen in a hard town, a tired man with a pencil and a stack of bills could finally rest.